A note in the Order's archives records the moment as follows. Sua Eminenza questa mattina si è portato personalmente all'isoletto, ove è stato già dato principio alla costruzione del forte Manuel. Accompagnata da molti gran croce e da una grande comitiva di cavalieri, affinché fosse in sua presenza collocata la prima pietra in detta fabbrica. Come seguito dopo aver l'eminenza sua lasciato ivi a futura memoria diverse monete. Indeed, it is of his zeal as a builder that Manuel de Villena is best remembered. The Manuel Theatre in Valletta, the Magistral Palace in Mdina, the Casa di Carità in Floriana, and Casa Leone in Sant'Arvenera are some of the other noteworthy examples of his munificence. Remember, stranger, we read on his tomb, that wherever you go on this island, you will meet monuments of his piety, his munificence, his constancy, and his charity. And undeniably, the building of Fort Manuel was Villena's proudest achievement in his short but fruitful 14-year reign. It was the one thing which he most wanted to be remembered for. The episode is immortalized on his funerary monument in St. John's Co-Cathedral, as we see in this detail from the bronze effigy on his tomb, showing him presenting a plan of Fort Manuel. The design of Fort Manuel is always attributed in the Order's records to René Jacob de Tignier, but as shown by Professor Denis De Luca, it was his deputy, Charles-François de Mondion, who was really responsible for its final design, and was certainly, in his capacity as Ingegnere della Religione, the person in charge of the supervision of the works through its long gestation period. As already mentioned earlier on in this lecture, there is nothing really special about Fort Manuel's planimetric design. Its simple rectangular plan with 4 corner bastions was a basic solution to the defense problem, a common standard recipe that goes back to Roman times. Bastion forts with similar plans can be found all over the world, from the citadel of Saint Martin de Ré in France all the way to the Spanish fort San Carlos in Florida. What is unique about Fort Manuel, however, is the manner in which it is constructed, both in the way that it is fashioned out of local Globigerina limestone and practically carved into the living rock, as well as the manner in which its various elements are all brought together in very elegant proportions. The Comte de Bourg-Lamique, who visited the island in 1761 after his long stint conducting the defense of French territories in Canada, described it as a modèle de fortification fait avec soin, that is, a model of fortification carefully built and complete in all its parts. Indeed, Fort Manuel brings and merges together 3 important elements in the art of fortification: engineering, architecture, and art. These are the qualities that define Baroque military architecture from all other forms of architecture and give it its monumental and visual power. Fort Manuel, by any account, represents the peak of military architecture. Fortification does not get better than this. As a matter of fact, after the 18th century, the architectural and aesthetic qualities of fortifications decline rapidly, particularly with the onset of the Industrial Age, when art no longer had a role to play, and forts become purely functional containers for cannon. Impersonalized concrete structures, as I like to say, that were a little different from the factories of the age. Here at Fort Manuel, however, art and engineering are brought together in perfect harmony to provide a sense of power and glory. The fort has 2 faces, so to speak. One is the businesslike landfront ancient, with its low-lying bastions and cavaliers bristling with embrasure and cannon, facing the enemy. The other is the internal architectural arrangement of barracks, church and monument centered around a large piazza. A Baroque mise-en-scène designed to be seen and admired, not by the enemy, but by the people in Valletta across the harbour. The barracks themselves, 4 large arcaded blocks, were at the time of their construction a very novel feature in Malta, where none of the forts up till then had had any form of dedicated troop accommodation. Soldiers had simply slept in the damp and airless casemates within the ramparts. Again, these barracks are a feature of French military engineering, inspired by Vauban's insistence on order within a garrison town of Fort. Fort Manuel barracks are, in fact, Mondion's second attempt at designing a barrack complex. The other, less impressive, was that built into the cramped, restricted piazza of Fort St. Elmo. These barracks were a luxury for the local troops, fitted as these were with their own gabinetti and cooking rooms, and shielded from the hot, suffocating sun by thick walls and cool arcades. In the middle of this arrangement, but off-center, stood a small church, somewhat disrupting the otherwise perfect harmony of the fort's symmetrical plan. A distortion that in fact is difficult to explain other than the military necessity to allow access to all parts of the enceinte. Apparently designed by Mondion himself, although some authors attribute it to the Italian architect Romano Carapecchia, this church was dedicated to Saint Anthony of Padua, Manuel de Villena's patron saint. Mondion was actually buried in its crypt. Unfortunately, the church suffered a direct hit during the Second World War and has stood partially demolished for the past decades until its recent expert restoration. The other element which defied functional consideration was the main gate of the fort, or Porta Reale as the Italians called it. In this Baroque period, the gate assumed the semblance of a triumphal arch, with its classicized features, decorations and trophies of arms. The one at Fort Manuel was surmounted by an escutcheon with the coat of arms of Grandmaster Villena and his bronze bust, while the heraldic symbols of his family name, a lion and a winged hand holding a sword, flanked the portal. In this age of absolutism, and make no mistake, the Grandmasters of the Order of St. John were veritable autocrats, the gateway also played a distinctive political role, becoming in itself a means of propaganda, exalting and communicating the power, might and authority of the ruler to his subjects. The elaborate ornamentation of trophies of arms, Latin inscriptions, heraldic devices and other elements of martial symbolism all served above all as a direct visual language designed to awe and subdue a society that was still largely illiterate. At Fort Manuel and in the other gateways built by Mondion, such as Port de Baume, Mdina, St. Helens Gate and Bourmla, etc., all this is achieved with a great sense of aesthetic sensitivity and spatial grace. In his competent hands, gateways were transformed into sublime monumental works of art, sensuous and refined in their proportions and composition. By the 18th century, gateway design had become the synthesis of what fortifications stood for: magnificence and military power. In Alberti's words, there was no greater security than true beauty and dignity, and although his claim that beautiful architecture could disarm an enemy's anger was somewhat overly optimistic, there was no divided opinion among architects and military engineers of the time about the dramatic effect of artistically designed fortifications on the human eye. Manoel, the Order's late 17th century resident engineer, for one, was quick to remind Grandmaster Carafa that in the design of fortifications it was important to give the eye la dovuta sua parte. An interesting feature of the Fort Manuel gateway was its drawbridge mechanism. This too was based on French design and is referred to in the Order's documents as Ponte Levatoio à la Vauban, that is, in the manner of Vauban, hence in the French style. It consisted of a wooden platform which rotated on itself and sank into a pit when in the lifted position. All Mondion's gateways were fitted with such a device, but actually these did not prove to be very popular because they had the tendency, if left unsecured, to sink under the weight of the persons walking over them. Such a comic incident happened to Grandmaster Pinto de Fonseca's carriage as it was making its way through Port de Baume. Suffice it to say, the Grandmaster was not at all amused on this occasion. Similarly based on the French style were the two pulveristes or powder magazines, the magazine à poudre, which stood on the two seaward-facing bastions. Again, the order's records refer to these structures as being à la Vauban. Indeed, Vauban had standardized their form of construction into a rectangular plan reinforced with lateral counterforts and fitted with a gabled roof. These dedicated buildings had very special features built into their design, so as to make them both bomb-proof, fireproof, and even damp-proof. The magazine's slanting roofs and barrel-vaulted interiors gave them great resistance against bombardment. Ventilation shafts, known as sfiatatori, and controlled access points ensured that no potentially dangerous material could be introduced